This is Langston Nalen on behalf of the Religica Theolab at the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. Today, Religica Theolab founder Reid Trice is in conversation with Dr. Serene Jones, who serves as president at the historic Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Dr. Jones is the author of several books, including Trauma and Grace, as well as her most recent title, Call It Grace. Dr. Jones is also the former president of the American Academy of Religion, and is a child, she notes, of the Oklahoma Plains. Take a listen.
I'm from New Mexico, recognizing how important context is to our lives and how we frame theology. What does it mean for you to be from the plains of Oklahoma?
Oh, well, that is a great question to start with. So I have not lived in Oklahoma steadily since I left there when I was 22, only a few years ago. But I still go back there regularly and having my whole extended family there. And for me, first, it captures, I think, for all of us, the degree to which where we were formed as children, how dramatically that impacts the way our imaginations work and the way we organize and order the world around us and find meaning in it in those crucial years that were formed. And for me, it means a very close connection to land and to community understood in smaller ways. I come from a small town. But it's also interesting that you could stand on our back porch in Enid, Oklahoma, and see, because we were on a slight rise, about 20 miles in every direction. And all the state of Oklahoma is divided up into what are called mile lines. So every mile there's a road, a dirt road that divides up the fields. And I have found as I began to write and then do research and then even now as a leader, that I map things in my imagination according to a big spatial area where you can see the mile lines and you can see, well, this is growing over here and this is growing over here and so owns this plot and this plot of land is got this kind of history. And over all of it is a big open sky. So with a sense of sort of maps and then a sense of open possibility, just kind of describes the hooks in my imagination that give order to the world.
Well, and in your book, the text Call It Grace, you note a painting of an oil rig or an oil kind of apparatus that's hanging on your wall. And it's a wonderful portrait of what you're just describing, I think, in terms of the open expanse and a recognition that, like that oil painting, today's public discourse is also a study of what's seen and unseen at the same time. And here we are at this inflection point in society today, which we wonder what the future of the country itself, under that larger canopy, is going to become in the years ahead. It's a time of honesty, and given your public comments, let's say, on moral injury, what's the national conversation and what's the civic honesty that must take place today?
Well, that's such a great question. For listeners, just a little more about that huge painting that I have that was done by a family friend. You can see the big sky and you see a sliver of earth, and then you realize it's an oil rig. What you realize about the oil rig is that you can see the top part of it, but all the activity is taking place underground, deep underground. You don't see it. It's also the place underground where all the damage is being done. And now increasingly with fracking. That's why I call it a study of what is seen and unseen. And it's the way our own minds work, but it's also the way we work as communities, and it's the way history works. And so here we are at an inflection point in the United States when all of the contradictions and harms and really horrid legacies from our past have sort of come up from underground and slapped us in the face. That's what makes this a sort of inflection point. And the question becomes then, what do we do with these moments where the earth sort of cracks open and what we've worked so hard, especially in the context of white supremacy, to tamp down and to pretend like it doesn't exist. What do we do when the earth cracks open and all that's been tamped down comes, above ground, and we have to look at it, and it's not going to let us go, and it's not going to go away until it's honestly grappled with and changes are made.
You're reminding me of theologian Paul Tillich right after World War II, writing about how the foundations are cracking or shaking, an illustration to a Hebrew text of the same kind of caliber. In your text, you also note, the loss of a childhood friend, that the faith of oneself, such as the time we're living in now, can be blown around like a tumbleweed. There are times where we feel like things are cracking open, like we're blown around. There's grief in the system. When you think of tumbling or the kind of troubling moral injuries that are lodged in us, white supremacy, the history of structural racism, our treatment of indigenous peoples in this country, and more, what are the hopeful signs that you see on the landscape for conversations that are happening or can happen, that you've said, amidst the tumbling and breaking and cracking, there's also hope here? What do you see?
This in part comes from the work I've done over the years on trauma, which is another way of talking about an aspect of moral injury. The process of healing and of change doesn't simply happen because things are named and talked about, but you cannot change things until they are named and they are explored and claimed. And then the process of change can begin. And I think that it's when that tumbleweed is blown around and you have to start talking about what that is, that these repressed and oppressed realities have the chance to actually enter our conscious mind, and we have the chance to take responsibility for them.
It's tough, isn't it? Because transgenerational trauma can also create a kind of societal amnesia. We may not see the very thing that's ailing us, and it may get lodged in family systems or even in a society's sense of itself. What's the theologian's job amidst amnesia, amidst forgetfulness, in terms of a context of trauma where we know as a society we have to move forward through it?
Well, the job of the theologian is, all theology is telling stories about the meaning of our life and why we're here and who we are before God. And theologians need to tell the story that amnesia is blocking so that it can be incorporated into the story of the meaning and purpose of our life and why we're here and who we are before God. We are the big transcendent storytellers. And until the history of chattel slavery and Native American genocide and the ongoing violence of patriarchy and misogyny, the devastation that we've wreaked upon our earth, ever deepening economic divides, until those come onto the stage of your conscious mind, they sort of sit back there untouched. And you're right, in a space of amnesia. And the theologian's job is to say, hey, no, look, this is here. Pull it out of the silence and put it on the table. And what's so fascinating for me as a person who is formed as a Christian theologian is, we have these scriptures that are filled with one after another of really horrible stories about the horrible things that people do to each other. But that's what's so amazing about being in religious communities where you have scriptures like that, is it's put on the table. It's there to see how God's people can do such horrible things to each other and still move forward and, in the presence of God, repent and repair and change.
In your writing, you talk about being raised in the disciples' kind of congregationalist context in the United States, particularly in that area, and you mentioned this word covenant. And from your reading, what I'm hearing is more than contract, more than a kind of transactional relationship. Covenant as promise. I wonder, do you think that might have to your words that you just shared, some resonance in terms of a covenantal reality that we share in the United States or in any particular society? Is there a kind of guiding promise that theologians are pointing to in one form or another? What do you think?
I do believe that speaking out of the theology I was raised with, that there is the promise of God to always be with us. And then there's the promise, the covenant, that we are always with each other and responsible for the common good. And so it's a sort of the covenant with God founds the covenant that we all have with one another, not limited to the church, but it's a sort of sense of that. And now we have all sorts of science and biology and psychology to back it up, but that we are actually all intimately bound together. And we live in covenant relationship with one another, even when we don't recognize it explicitly. And so to make it explicit is to help us become more fully human.
There is a series, there are a number of scientists and theologians, scholars, as you know, around the country, and also out here in Seattle, working on cross-cultural capacities or possibilities between, say, science and theology or science and religious studies, in particular at genomics or artificial intelligence or brain science, and really fascinating collaborative efforts going on to what you've just named. But there's something I wonder, it's in your book, and it's something I really enjoyed reading about in terms of theology as a language, science as a language. All these disciplines require a certain kind of language, although theology has a kind of transcendent sensibility to it. But then you say anyone can tell the story. What it takes is courage. It just takes courage. Is that the most important quality, do you think, as you work with students, when you work with communities? Is it the courage to be that should be our guiding star at this time in our country?
Courage is not the only thing you need, but if you don't have courage, then the other things have a hard time falling into place, because it's so much more common to simply go with the flow of what's happening around you. And the courage to stand on your convictions and to tell the story and be shaped by the story that runs against what everyone around you is saying or what the dominant culture says. If you can't do that, then you can't actually get off of first base and start playing the game.
We're hosting a conference here on gratitude, injury, and restoration in a pandemic age through the center. And I'm also asking scholars and those who are leading institutions and centers who are thinking about virtue ethics and other qualities. What's the nature of gratitude? And is it essential today? Is it a form of generosity? Is it a part of that covenantal promise that we've been discussing? And I'm always interested and kind of marvel at the responses that come back. Is there anything on the nature of gratitude that you've said, yeah, this is kind of where I land theologically, or as a person, as a storyteller, as a narrative dealer? What do you think?
As a theologian, I write a lot about grace, and that is just the unbounded, unceasing, unlimited love of God that falls upon the world and everyone and the world itself. And for me, the most profound level of gratitude, and again, we're going back to Tillich here, but it comes in that moment when sometimes you least expect it, but you look around and you realize I'm here and I could not be here. And yet I am here. It's gratitude for just the mere reality of existence. It could not be, and yet it is.
You've been listening to the Religica Theolab podcast in the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. To learn more about the center's work and for resources to be used in local communities, visit us online at seattleu.edu/thecenter.